Chapter 8 covers evolution and natural selection. And so first of all, we need to start with some basic definitions. Evolution, its definition is genetic change over time. That is all evolution is, that's all that it states, that there is genetic change over time in a variety of species. So that's what evolution is, and that's what I'd be looking for definitions on exams. And evolution happens to populations. It doesn't happen to individuals. It happens to an entire population. So a population is a group of the same species living together in a particular area. And we'll look more at populations and how evolution can only affect populations as we go through this chapter. First of all, we want to look at some examples of how we can watch evolution occurring. There's lots and lots of experiments out there that show this, but one of them is really quite cute. They take fruit flies, and normally a regular fruit fly, it can survive for about 20 hours or so without food, and then it dies of starvation. So that's the average survival time of regular fruit flies. And if we plot out right here, we have this bell curve showing that some fruit flies don't last anywhere near 20 hours, some last up to about 35, but in general, somewhere between 5 and 35 hours, with most of them starving at the 20-hour time mark. So that's what a normal fruit fly would have. What they did for this experiment is they would put fruit flies into a cage and remove their food and wait until most of them had starved to death. Now note that each one of these little bugs in here represents about 500 fruit flies. So this was a large population of fruit flies, and they would wait until about 80% of them had starved, and the few that were remaining, they would take those, return food to them, so give them food, allow them to reproduce and lay eggs to produce the next generation. And they did this for many generations. So starting with their first generation of fruit flies, the average starvation time was at 20 hours. After the second generation, it had slid over just a little bit, and the average survival time was 23 hours. They continued doing this for 60 generations. So 60 generations of fruit flies where they would let 80% of them starve, and then that 20% that survived, they would let them reproduce. After 60 generations, the average survival time for fruit flies with starvation was 160 hours, which was way beyond this original curve. So it's clear out here somewhere at 160 hours. So that shows evolution. So a genetic change over time that allowed those fruit flies to survive longer and longer time periods without food. So that shows evolution. And this works really well with fruit flies because they have short lives, they have lots and lots and lots of offspring. And in this case, we were looking at survival. And towards the end of the experiment, the fruit flies actually even looked different. Instead of the regular kind of skinny-bodied fruit fly, they were actually fairly plump little fruit flies because they would start storing more food as body fat instead of just planning on having food available on a regular basis. And this has lots of interesting implications for a variety of species, including humans. So in your Mean Genes book, there's a chapter, starts on page 35, it's called Fat, Please Don't Feed the Humans, and it looks at human history and the fact that historically humans could go through periods of abundance, so lots and lots of food available, and also periods of starvation, where there was so little food available, many starved, and some obviously survived. So read the chapter on Fat, Please Don't Feed the Humans, and write a paper over it. You need to include a brief summary of the chapter, so tell me in your own words what the chapter discussed. Make sure you're using paragraphs, not bullet points, and then tell me what you learned and what impact that chapter had on you after you've read it. So that's your assignment. looking at history, so since we're looking at evolution, evolution is really not a new idea. It's a fairly new word. However, the idea of organisms changing over time has been looked at for a very long time, starting with Aristotle. Aristotle was one of the first to start collecting species and describing them and identifying them all. Aristotle hoped to collect and describe all living organisms on Earth. He just didn't realize how big the Earth was and how many species there were. And also in Aristotle's time, up through about the time of Darwin, it was believed that the Earth is only about 6,000 years old. That belief is based on the fact that that's about the oldest written texts that we have, are 6,000 years old. And so that's when writing was first developed, and so that's as far back as we had written history, is what that time scale is based on. They also thought, well, everything was created at the same time because they didn't see anything new coming about, and they never saw anything actually go extinct, for sure. They believed nothing ever changed and nothing ever died out. And a lot of that was based on the fact that, well, human time scale is very, very short, maximum of maybe 100 years or so, where evolution occurs on a thousands to millions of years time scale for the most part. Let's look at some history of kind of our modern evolutionary ideas. And starting in the 17 and 1800s, a gentleman named George Buffon did some calculations looking at kind of how fast rock cooled, and knowing that the Earth was formed as a molten planet and had a now solid crust surrounding a molten core still, he did some calculations and estimated the Earth had to be much, much older than previously believed, substantially older than that 6,000 years that we had written history for, because it would take much longer than that for the Earth to cool down and become inhabitable. So life had to be much, much older than currently thought. Some other discoveries, Georges Cuvier, he started collecting fossils and analyzing and studying fossils. And here are just some of the fossils he looked at. So mastodons, Irish elk, this giant ground sloth, which is huge compared to a human. It's, well over 6 feet tall, this giant ground sloth. And so he was studying these fossils and describing them and showing, well, extinction probably had occurred prior to Cuvier's time, because much of the Earth hadn't been explored. If fossils were found, they were just a curiosity, or they figured that that organism still lived, it had just left the area and was living someplace else. By Cuvier's time, that was less likely to be true. So it was showing that these things had actually died off. And one example of that is actually this giant ground sloth right here in Iowa. If you've ever seen a honey locust tree, a natural honey locust tree, now there are decorative varieties you can get and plant at your house that don't have this trait. However, if you see one growing just wild, they have these horrible, nasty spikes coming out of the bark all along the tree. And as it gets older and older, this tree gets more and more of these awful, awful spikes. Probably not a tree that you want to hug, because it would be quite painful. Well, the tree is native to Iowa, and these thorns that it has are actually there to protect it from this giant ground sloth. So Iowa used to have these giant ground sloths roaming around and trying to eat the honey locust trees. As a response, the tree developed these barb-like spikes or thorns to prevent the honey locust tree from being eaten by the sloth. And in fact, several years ago, I had a student of mine brought a big bucket full of bones she'd found in her grandmother's yard, but her grandmother lived on a farm, so it was a fairly large area. They'd been digging to put up a fence and came in and found these bones, so she threw them all in a bucket and brought them in because she was in a biology class. And I looked at them, and they looked like they belonged to a giant ground sloth, and for confirmation, I actually took them up to Iowa State and had that confirmed by an expert up there, showing that, yes, this giant ground sloth had been, at one time, living in her grandmother's, basically, backyard. So these used to be in Iowa as well, but they're obviously extinct. Moving on to other individuals that had also looked at organisms changing, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck he looked at species changing over time, and his suggestion was that it occurred because of use. So they changed over time because what the living species used. So he would look at information on, say, giraffes, and the giraffes spend their whole day wandering around, stretching up into the trees. And so he proposed a hypothesis that, well, because the giraffes were constantly stretching their necks, each generation would be born with slightly longer and longer necks. And this had to do with the way they thought reproduction occurred. They didn't know about DNA or genes. People at the time actually thought that there were little tiny molecules called gemmules throughout the body, and at the moment of conception, all these gemmules would migrate from all over, the tips of your fingers, your arms, top of your head, your toes, all into your reproductive organs and be passed on to the offspring. And then the gemmules from the mother and the father would battle it out, and the stronger gemmules would win, and that child would have the characteristics of those gemmules. So he believed that stretching and stretching would make those molecules stronger and so be passed on to the offspring. And that fit in with what people believed of inherited traits at the time. And something I should also mention, does anybody recognize this fellow here? Since we're not in class, I can't see any hands raised, but you may, if you like history especially, you may recognize that fellow as Napoleon Bonaparte, and he actually did a lot for science. He was commander of an army, and they would invade other areas, and at the time of Napoleon, it was very, very common for gentlemen to have the hobby of science. So they would collect specimens and fossils and interesting things and analyze them, and so they'd have these nice libraries full of just all kinds of different fossils and interesting biological specimens. Well, what he would do, since he was running the invading army, whenever he came across collections or even museums from other countries, so private collections or museums, he would seize all of that and ship it back home. And he actually established an institute that had about 12 experts, all of them equally ranked and equally paid, and each of them was in charge of a slightly different area. And Jean-Baptiste Lamarck and Georges Cuvier both worked at Napoleon's Institute, covering slightly different areas. And by the way, these two really did not like each other. There was a lot of contention between the two of them. In fact, Georges Cuvier, when Lamarck died, he wrote an awful, awful, scathing obituary of Lamarck. However, Cuvier died soon after that as well, before he had published his scathing remarks of Lamarck, and they were just found in his notes later on after his own death. So Napoleon did a lot because he brought these two together, as well as many others, at this institute that he opened and founded. Other individuals that contributed, a gentleman named Charles Lyell. Now, Charles Lyell was a geologist, and he studied mountain formation and different rock types and things like that, and he wrote a book called Principles of Geology, where he discussed how long it would take for mountains to form and erode, and weather patterns, and how the Earth had to be much older even than Georges Buffon had suggested, based on studying mountain formations and rocks. And Charles Darwin and Lyell, this was a while after Darwin's trip, actually became very good friends and were friends for the rest of their life, and in communication with each other. So Lyell had a huge influence on Darwin, as did these other scientists before him.